trying to fit about 100 years worth of history into 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to do my best to cram it all in. I do want to highlight three major points that I think will be relevant to this discussion. First of all, when dealing with religious pluralism in Israel, we're dealing with issues relating to how Judaism is treated in Israel and what is legally allowed in Israel in terms of Jewish practice and lifestyle events. Another thing we're going to deal with is the 20% minority in Israel that is not Jewish, and how that population, which represents Christian and Muslim communities respectively, has their issues of religious observance overseen. And then the greater question, which dates back to the dawn of Zionism, is how we in the diaspora can relate to these issues in Israel. Should we relate to those issues, and what are some of those historical tensions? So, just to go into some of the very basic history, we do see a clash that has been in Israeli and pre-Israel Yishuv society between the religious establishment and secular establishment. Here on the left, we see a picture of people on a kibbutz dancing the hora in 1947. And on the right, contrasting this secular socialist ideal, which was part of the main foundation of the culture, society, and government of Israel. And on the right, we have today's chief rabbis. We have on the left, Ashkenazi Rabbi David Lau, and on the right, Sephardic Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef. They are selected by a committee that is appointed by the rabbinate, and they serve 10-year terms. So, in Israel, all religious matters are determined by religious authorities. The Jewish authority is the chief rabbinate, there is a Muslim authority, there is a Christian authority, and there is a Druze religious authority. So all of the various groups within Israel do have an official body that has governmental and legal say over how issues relating to marriage, conversion to a religion, burial ceremonies, divorce, which is a big contested issue in Israeli society, are handled. This system was established in 1921 by the British, who came in and saw that there could be a potential clash between the religious life that was happening in the Yishuv, which is the pre-state Jewish community of Palestine, and the slowly growing religious component. And so the British, a year before the British mandate was actually made official by the League of Nations, which happened in 1922, they decided to appoint an Ashkenazi chief rabbi and a Sephardic chief rabbi. Those institutions are still in place. Moving forward a little bit to 1947, as the Yishuv and their leadership saw that it was very likely that a state could happen, Ben-Gurion sat down with the religious parties that were connected to the already established rabbinate, and we came out with what is known as the status quo agreement. And the status quo agreement essentially states that all matters relating to Judaism and religious life in Israeli society will be determined by the rabbinate, which has legal say over these matters. And as I mentioned before, this includes things like marriage, divorce, conversion, burial, and likewise, who in the state of Israel is actually considered Jewish, and which practices will be considered Jewish as well. Now, one thing that I'll add to this, and this is kind of a joke in the field, but it's seen that even secular Israelis, which represent the majority of Israel's Jewish population, are non-practicing Orthodox Jews. Meaning that while they may not necessarily be practicing Jews, their view of Judaism is an Orthodox one. So when they do actually go to synagogue, they're going to an Orthodox synagogue. Those are the only synagogues that the state of Israel actually pays for. If you are one of the 50 Reform congregations in Israel, you do not receive funding from the government. Your rabbis are not allowed to marry anyone. They are not allowed to perform a conversion, etc., whereas the Orthodox interpretations are the ones that are represented by the rabbinate, thus the government, and this includes funding on the one hand, and on the other hand, who's actually allowed to do what. Yeah, David, please.
When Ben Gurion made that agreement, was it because there wasn't enough secular Jewish population to have that power without the Orthodox?
So it's interesting. It's actually the opposite. There was so much of secular society that they thought that since Israel was going to be ostensibly a secular, for all intents and purposes, socialist state in the late 40s, that they wanted to have a religious body that would keep that society Jewish, quote unquote. So they deferred to the Orthodox establishment that had been placed there to preside over these Jewish issues, to maintain the Jewish character of the state, while he figured that the rest of the state would continue on in this secular capacity as it had been developing since the dawn of Zionism in the late 19th century. However, he did not anticipate the religious population growing in the way that it has, and more specifically, growing with its ability to have political. And we see that while ultra-Orthodox members of Israeli society only represent about 10% of the population and a proportional number in the Knesset, they are a very important part of the Knesset and right-wing bloc's voting ability. They have a very slim majority, much like we see with the Republican Party in the United States today. And if Netanyahu wants his coalition to get anything through the government, it has to be passed through these individuals who represent this very small but important faction within the government. So, the Knesset website actually lays this out quite candidly, which I find fascinating. And so I pulled this quote just to see how Israel is representing itself internationally with regard to these issues on their English translated website. So they say, Israel guarantees equality under the law to all its citizens, vouchsafing, giving, their rights to vote and be elected. The expression of its Jewishness, however, is difficult to define, and Israelis cannot even agree on whether the country should be defined as the Jewish state or the state of the Jewish people. And is Judaism a religion or a national culture and ethnicity? Judaism in Israel is reflected in values, politics, and culture as much as it is religious practice. In Israeli law, and this is very important, marriages are carried out by the sanctioned authorities of each religious community, Muslims, the various Christian denominations, Druze, and so on. For Jews, this currently means that marriage and divorce are handled solely by the Orthodox rabbinate. There is no way to conduct an interfaith marriage, and many Israelis whose Jewish status is in doubt, mostly referring to former Soviet Union immigrants who are not deemed as halakhically Jewish. I'll go into a little bit more detail. Or Africans as well, correct? We saw this being played out with the questionable conversion of certain Jews in sub-Saharan Africa by a conservative rabbi, and this also includes certain members of the Ethiopian Jewish community. But we'll get into a little bit more about that. Opponents of the status quo, what I was referring to earlier, argue that this situation harms freedom of religion and infringes basic human rights. Yet, the recognition of alternative forms of marriage or the introduction of a civil procedure would have far-reaching and some believe possibly destructive consequences for the Jewish identity of Israel's citizens and the unity of Israeli society. So, they very candidly lay out these issues and this tension, whereas many in Israeli society feel that without this religious body dictating orthodox interpretations of Judaism upon Israel, that it's possible that those, as they see, pure interpretations of Judaism could be lost in Israeli society, and many feel in the world. So they see themselves as a beacon of maintaining Judaism in its most raw form. So, in addition to this, we also see political divisions that go beyond just life cycle events between the Orthodox community in Israel and the Israeli government. It has been the case that up until 2012, there had been something called the Tal Law, which allowed Orthodox yeshiva students to get out of their military service. Now, this was something that was deeply upsetting to many in secular Israeli society. Utah law was repealed, and it is now the case that Orthodox young men are required to go into the army. However, the Israeli government has not quite figured out how they are going to enforce it. They have small units within the military that are actually designed for Orthodox Jews to bring them into the fold of Israeli society as the government sees it. There's also programs to provide tech training and other things to try and, I guess, create some sort of unity between these seemingly disparate parts of Israeli society. And interestingly, this group has a huge base of support in the United States. This is a picture from the Barclays Arena in Brooklyn, where the Brooklyn Nets play. This is a group of 20,000 Orthodox Jews rallying against the Israeli government, condemning their policies, forcing young Orthodox men to join the army. This was last year. So just to give a little background on what progressive Judaism looks like in Israel, we have about 50 Reform congregations and 50 conservative congregations. The Reform movement started in the late 50s. The conservative movement started in the 70s. And while these communities are growing, as I mentioned earlier, they do not get any funding from the Israeli government. There's one Reform rabbi in Israel, actually a woman, who does receive funding from the government. However, it comes from the Ministry of Sports and Culture and not through any religious establishment. And again, because Reform rabbis and conservative rabbis cannot carry out marriage ceremonies or anything related to a religious life cycle event, and there can't be intermarriage for those either Russian or Ethiopian immigrants that are not deemed halakhically Jewish by the rabbinate. They are allowed to be married in Israel, but they can't have their marriage ceremony in Israel. So here we see a picture of a group marriage ceremony in Cyprus, where Russian immigrants and Jews deemed halakhically Jewish by the rabbinate are in a group wedding ceremony. There are actually tour companies that organize these, set up all their paperwork so they can take a quick trip to Cyprus, get married, and come back to Israel and be legally married. So it is possible to get married outside of Israel and come back. Even if you're a gay couple, you can do that. Even if you're an interfaith gay couple, you can do that. It just can't be done in Israel.
So it's okay once they do it that way, it doesn't have a problem.
Yeah, as long as it happens outside the state of Israel, it's fine. And there are many different arrangements that can be made. You could be married by a judge in a courthouse in New York and come back to Israel and have that marriage recognized. It just can't be carried out in Israel. So we likewise see, for example, the issue over the egalitarian prayer space being a flashpoint between American and Israeli Jewish establishments. And the question is, while American Judaism has impacted Israeli Judaism, we see about 100 American-style congregations that are funded almost fully by the American movements that they represent. Will it grow, and will it actually have an impact in politics where it needs to, should these laws surrounding these rabbinic authorities' ability to actually practice in Israel? And so I just want to end on this, which I find fascinating. The recent and very controversial nation-state bill actually has an entire stipulation called connection to the Jewish people. And they say, the state will strive to ensure the safety of the members of the Jewish people in trouble or in captivity due to the fact of their Jewishness or their citizenship. The state shall act within the diaspora to strengthen the affinity between the state and members of the Jewish people, and the state shall act to preserve the cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people among Jews in the diaspora. So this is very interesting that we see this language being written into the most recent basic law of Israel, where they're saying we want to ensure ties with the diaspora, we want to ensure their rights, yet those diaspora forms of Judaism are not legally accepted or seen as legitimate within the state.